Hello, everyone, and welcome to this seminar on present and future directions in cultural fire, supported by the Deakin Science and Society Network and by the Bushfire and Natural Hazards Cooperative Research Centre. My name is Timothy Neale, and I'm a Senior Research Fellow at Deakin University's Alfred Deakin Institute, and I'm Deputy Convener of the Deakin Science and Society Network, an initiative to support interdisciplinary research. I'd like to begin this session by first acknowledging the traditional owners of the land, the country on which I'm sitting, in this particular slice of Melbourne, Australia, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. And I'd like to also pay my respects and acknowledge the traditional owners of all the places that you, our audience today, are listening from. This seminar has been put together to explain and discuss some of the current initiatives that are occurring around cultural fire in southeastern Australia. Cultural fire, as our speakers will explain, is an expansive way of understanding fire's place in our surrounds. As many Aboriginal people say, right fire, right people, right country. That's cultural fire. Cultural fire is not just about cultural burning, that is applying fire to the landscape, but also about fire's right relationship to country and to people. And therefore, it also brings into consideration other dimensions, including not only other ways of using fire, but also its relationship to waterways, certain key animals, plants, stories, so on. Before introducing our speakers and handing over to them, they'll be taking up hopefully much of the airtime today. I'd like to set the stage slightly by considering some of the things shaping cultural fire today. And this is just a very brief account, and I don't pretend that this is a complete list or history, it's just really some of the thoughts to hopefully usefully frame what follows. Throughout the seminar, speakers will be mentioning different resources for people, and we'll also be posting links for people who want to learn more about the topic. So I'll just share my screen. So first, as many will be well aware, Southeast Australia has recently experienced the disastrous 2019-2020 bushfire season, also popularly known as Black Summer. This terrible season has affected many Aboriginal peoples and communities directly. It has also prompted an unprecedented amount of interest amongst non-Indigenous people, politicians, news media, and others. And their interest is in Aboriginal people's fire knowledge and practices. Several official inquiries are now focused on reviewing the causes and impacts of this past combustive summer in the southeast. And many of these inquiries have been asked to consider matters related to cultural fire, though often problematically in terms of how cultural fire might serve non-Indigenous people's interests. So this is one context. Second, again, as many will well know, traditional owners and other Aboriginal peoples have been asserting their sovereignty since the arrival of settlers on this continent in the 18th and 19th centuries. And they've been fighting for their rights and authority in country ever since. This includes maintaining ancient and ongoing relations with fire, which have been actively suppressed and marginalized by settler governments and the land and fire agencies since colonization began. In recent decades, some Aboriginal peoples have had significant success in having their rights and authority in country legally and politically recognised. And this has led to developing practical and policy changes in the revitalisation of cultural fire in Southeast Australia, often in partnership with governments, private landholders and others. Third, amidst the emerging conversation about cultural fire amongst non-Indigenous people and between non-Indigenous people and Aboriginal peoples, the focus often falls on the pre-colonial past, that is fire management before colonization. This is an incredibly important history, and it's obvious that we need to understand that history. But it also arguably needs to be complemented with a thorough understanding of the current context, emerging projects and obstacles they face, recent policy changes, and possible future directions, i.e. what is possible, what is happening. Cultural fire practitioner Victor Stephenson has recently written and spoken about the need to put Aboriginal peoples in the driver's seat with fire management. So what is practically happening now? and what could be happening soon to that end. That's part of why we're meeting today. Finally, before I introduce the speakers, a quick note that in planning today's seminar, we realized it has a bit of a Victorian skew. This is simply the situation several of the speakers know best, and we discuss it to highlight some of the challenges and opportunities at the present moment, not to pretend that this is more than one part of the work that is occurring out there in Southeast Australia right now. And there's in fact been some really great conversations and events over the past few weeks around cultural fire that I encourage you to also look at. For instance, seminars by the Centre for Social Impact in WA, Seed Mob, Groundswell, and others. So with all that said, let me introduce our speakers and the format. What's going to happen is that each speaker is going to briefly present for about 5 or 6 minutes, and then we'll move to a discussion of common themes and points of interest before taking some questions from you, the audience. I'll be chairing the discussion here on Zoom, and my wonderful colleagues Tao Fan and Will Smith will be moderating the YouTube live chat. If you're on YouTube live and you have any questions, please post them in the chat and they will pass them on to us. You can also post them on Twitter, but make sure you use the hashtag SSN Seminar or tweet us at SSN Deakin. Okay, without any further ado, it is my absolute pleasure to introduce our panel of speakers today. Our first speaker, Bhiamie Williamson, is an Aolai man from northwest New South Wales and southwest Queensland. He's a PhD candidate and research associate in the Centre for Aboriginal Economic Policy Research at the Australian National University. Bhiamie has previously held positions with ACT Parks and Conservation Services, where he played a key role in designing the cultural burning program in the ACT. Our second speaker, Matt Shanks, is a Nira Ilum Bullock man from Taungurung Nation. He works for the Federation of Victorian Traditional Owners Corporation as a natural and cultural resource management advisor. This role sees him support Victorian traditional owners to reactivate traditional owner rights, to manage country and reinvigorate cultural fire knowledge and practice. Our third speaker, Scott Falconer, is Deputy Chief Fire Officer and Director of Forest and Fire Operations for the Department of Environment, Land, Water and Planning in Victoria. He spent almost 30 years working in natural resource management, and in 2017, he received the Lord Mayor's Bushfire Appeal Churchill Fellowship to investigate how to create partnerships with traditional owners with a focus on enabling the reintroduction of cultural burning practices. And our fourth speaker, Minda Murray, is a Yorta Yorta and Duderoa woman and currently a First Nations academic associate at the Australian National University, about to commence her PhD researching Aboriginal self-determination in Victoria. She has a career spanning over 10 years in the public sector, working on environment issues, Aboriginal policy, and public service emergency response as a firefighter. So these are our four speakers. I'm very much looking forward to hearing what they have to say, and I will hand it over now to Bhiamie.
Great. Thank you very much, Tim. It's wonderful to be with everyone and to be speaking as a part of this panel. So I too would like to acknowledge country, and the country that I'm joining you from is of course Ngunnawal country here in the ACT. We all know how important it is for Aboriginal people to be embedded in their community and country, and for those that seen the river behind me, that's actually a photo of my country up in northwest New South Wales. It's a Barwon River, the old Brewarrina Mission. So to kick off the panel, I will reflect firstly on my time helping design the cultural burning program here in the ACT, before moving on to highlight what I believe are some of the key future directions that can expand this body of work that we now know as cultural burning. So firstly, the ACT has what I believe to be quite a high functioning cultural burning program anywhere in Australia. There is a team of Aboriginal rangers within the ACT Parks and Conservation Services, known as the Murrumbung Rangers, who conduct discrete cultural burning activities throughout various parts of the ACT. So I was involved in the creation of this burning program when I was an employee of Parks and Conservation Services in 2015. My role was to create, I guess, a policy basis from which the Murrumbung team could consult with traditional owner groups, plan burns and carry out these activities. But there were a number of complicating factors. Chief among them is that traditional owners in the ACT, the NonAboriginal people, do not enjoy any formal recognition of their rights and interests in country. There exists no native title, no land rights, no co-management or joint management arrangements, or any other sort of recognition processes for NonAboriginal people to own, possess and manage country. Added to this is the complex web of bureaucratic arrangements for managing the land and in particular putting fire into the landscape. So in the absence of formal recognition, the idea of creating an entirely new cultural burning program was unrealistic. So what we did was that we grafted the key elements needed in consultation, planning, preparation and conducting cultural burning onto the existing bureaucratic frameworks within ACT parks. This was done through the creation of a few strategic documents. We created a cultural fire framework and also a set of guidelines for fuel and fire management of culturally significant areas. Over the last 5 years, this work has grown exponentially, and there have now been dozens of cultural burns implemented and hundreds of associated activities. One of the key lessons from this body of work, to my mind, is that formal recognition is helpful to get people back on country, but it's not necessary. What you do need, what is necessary, are allies, a friendly policy environment, capacity of Aboriginal staff to conduct burns, and also key people driving the work. But the good work that continues to be done in the ACT, as it is being done in many places, and I look forward to hearing some of the instances of people down in Victoria carrying out these activities, it's only one element of a larger conversation that we really need to start having. Next slide, thanks, Tim. So much of the commentary, especially following the summer bushfires that we've had, has focused attention on Aboriginal people's cultural burning, and rightfully so. So we've seen an explosion of interest from media, academics and land management agencies, and just people from, from society in general, asking serious questions and agitating to promote Indigenous land management and using fire to do that. However, and this slide that you see in front of you is just a grab of a few key headlines that have been through the media since January. However, thinking and talking about cultural burning only limits rather than liberates Indigenous land and water management. By focusing on cultural burning only, what is missed is the opportunity to engage at a much deeper level of, I guess, human existence or coexistence in the world. To highlight my point, I want to draw your attention to the Traditional Owner Settlement Act, also known as the TOS Act in Victoria. So for those who are not aware of the Traditional Owner Settlement Act, it's legislation designed to support the formal recognition of traditional owner groups in Victoria. One of the key features of this legislation is that it allows traditional owner groups in Victoria and the Victorian government to negotiate the joint management, or in some cases, the sole management and return of national parks within their defined geographical footprint. These settlements can include resources and training opportunities to further support groups, and in particular support to implement or re-implement cultural burning. Generally speaking, the Traditional Owner Settlement Act is seen as one of the more progressive pieces of legislation in Australia. However, even in something as progressive as the TOS Act, there is still a sleight of hand happening. Whilst the legislation allows groups to negotiate joint or even sole management and the return of national parks, what it does not allow is for groups to negotiate the meaning of a national park. Next slide, thanks, Tim. A national park is itself a construct of Western thought, but it's a construct that now has a large amount of legal regulation, and that regulation has been designed to not necessarily reflect or support the resurgence of Aboriginal land management. For us to realise the full potential of something like cultural burning, we need to question the systems and structures within which cultural burning occurs. Whilst they take place within a legal construct of a national park or other protected area, they will be required to adhere to the strict rules governing land and water management in those places. And these are rules that have been written not by Aboriginal people. So cultural burning has people questioning how we do things and looking at Indigenous knowledges and practices to uncover new or old ways, depending on how you look at it, of managing the land with fire. But what we need to have a larger look at, is the bigger picture and ask what Indigenous knowledges and perspectives can teach all of Australia, and indeed throughout the world, about how we relate and exist within our landscapes. And I've got up here just a few questions that people can further consider in the hope that it kind of, promotes some good discussion at the back end of this. So I'll wait there, and I look forward to responding to questions that are posed.
Thanks very much, Bhiamie. Next, we have Matt Shanks.
Thanks, Tim. And first I'd like to start by acknowledging country I'm on today. That is the country of the Woiwurrung. I'd like to acknowledge and pay my respects to their elders, past, present and emerging. And I think that's a good start, a good place to begin. It was the elders and knowledge holders, particularly of cultural fire, but also other traditional owner land management techniques that really drove the development of the cultural fire strategy. There has been, as we've heard today already, a huge increase in the interest in cultural burning practices, largely as a result from the fires that ravaged country in the summer just gone. But this doesn't sort of mark an increase in the advocacy and work that traditional owners, all around Australia, and in particular Southeast Australia, where a lot of these fires occurred, a lot of the work that they've been doing to reinvigorate cultural fire knowledge and practice, as well as a whole range of other techniques for managing country over the last decades. I work for the Federation of Victorian Traditional Owner Corporations. My role there, as Tim has mentioned, is to support traditional owners to reactivate their knowledges and practices for managing country. And one of those was supporting the development of the Victorian Traditional Owner Cultural Fire Strategy. Its purpose to support and enable traditional owners to reinvigorate cultural fire practice across all country types, including all land tenure, with all range of partners on private land and public lands, including Department of Environment, Land, Water and Planning, Parks Victoria, CFA and other private landholders. And it's important here to note that cultural fire is more than just a practice, it's more than just a technique, it's part of a suite of knowledges and practices that traditional owners implement on country to fulfil their cultural obligations to ensure the health of country. Next slide. The cultural fire strategy was developed over a 3-year period. It was founded on the voice of elders, knowledge and traditional and cultural fire knowledge holders. And through the process, we were able to participate in many conversations on country with elders, exploring various dreaming stories, creation stories of fire, and the governance of fire through Aboriginal law. There's high-level engagement with our agency partners to look at the barriers and enablers in place to ensure that cultural fire practice was able to be led by traditional owners. And importantly, lots of learning from traditional owners based on their experiences trying to activate their rights to manage country through the use of cultural fire practice. Next slide. As I mentioned earlier, the sort of early formation of the strategy was founded on elders' voice, and dreaming stories were a key part of that. Both dream stories found in the ethnohistoric record, those that are published, and also those that have been passed on orally that may not be recorded in the ethnohistoric records. Those were used in this purpose, those fire creation stories and other fire governance stories, and can be in some way, and I in no way wish to diminish their authority, as contemporary policy statements that show us how to behave and act towards each other, to country, and to other animals, plants and beings on country. This similar approach has been used and adapted for other strategy and policy development processes that me and my colleagues are supporting Victorian traditional owners to do, like I mentioned earlier, to reinvigorate that suite of traditional owner-led practices to manage country. Next slide. This is a list of the 6 principles developed through the process. I won't linger on this page for too long. These are all available in the Victorian Traditional Owner Cultural Fire Strategy that I encourage all of you to read for a more in-depth understanding. But as Tim mentioned right in the beginning, cultural burning, cultural fire is right fire, right time and right way. So that is that it's led by the traditional owners of country through applying cultural law and reading country and a deep understanding of country. Next slide. Just a brief one. This next slide is a photo taken at the launch of the Cultural Fire Strategy in 2019, and following this this event. Next slide. My colleagues and I have been working to support traditional owners to develop implementation plans for the strategy. Traditional owner corporations, as the representative organisations for First Nations people here in Victoria, looking to develop budgets and work plans over the next 5 years, 1 to 5 years, primarily focusing on the foundational knowledge governance systems, passing on that knowledge from elders to youngers, and really starting to strengthen those knowledge systems of fire, and restoring the knowledge system that still exists today in country. The identification of scenario sites to pilot these processes that Victorian traditional owners have been undertaking for the last couple of years through the Cultural Fire Strategy is underway and looking to expand across all traditional owner groups, as well as connecting cultural fire knowledge and practice to other management techniques for caring for country. As Tim mentioned, it is intimately linked to the management of waterways, of other sites on country, and intimately linked all within cultural landscapes that govern the management of country, and how humans and particularly traditional owners have and continue to engage with country for forever before and ever into the future. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Matt. And I'd like to congratulate you for keeping incredibly well to time. Next, we have Scott Faulkner.
Good afternoon, everybody, and thanks, Tim, and everybody listening. I'd also like to acknowledge that I'm on Dja Dja Wurrung country, where I am in semi-ISO at home here in Victoria, looking out at beautiful box ironbark forest around my house, and pay my respects to their elders past, present and future. Obviously, well, I'm a non-Aboriginal person, and I work in a fire agency or a land management agency that does fire. The picture you're looking at is Mick Burke. Mick's a Dja Dja Wurrung Yorta Yorta man who now works in our fire agency as the agency's first designated Aboriginal fire planner. His sole purpose is to work with other traditional owner groups to have burns nominated by them, integrated into our system, and that's something that we're all very proud of. I should also say that working with Dja Dja Wurrung and travelling overseas with Trent Nelson and Tim Kanoa, 2 Aboriginal men as part of a Churchill Fellowship, the slides that I'll show you, I'll talk to key lessons that we've learned, and I'm coming from an agency perspective, but working very closely in partnership with TO groups, and this has also been guided very heavily by the Victorian Traditional Owner Cultural Fire Strategy that our agency have been involved in as well. So next slide, please, Tim. Not sure if the next slide's come up. There it is. these are recommendations that were taken from both our learnings in Victoria and our learnings overseas. And I won't go through them all individually. There's 2 pages of recommendations which are available in the fellowship report that we produced. But I will highlight 5 really key learnings for discussion later as well, if there are questions. And these are consistent with, Bhiamie mentioned, the legal rights and connection of Aboriginal people to country must be recognised, and where possible, formal agreements established between government agencies and representative Aboriginal parties to guide and hold parties accountable. So with Dja Dja Wurrung, we started with them 5 years ago. We had a conversation where they discussed they wanted to return cultural burning. At that point, we knew very little about that and how to go about it. They entered in under the TOSA Act that was talked about into a recognition settlement agreement, which essentially made them equal partners in joint management of their country. And that's been a very significant learning, guiding principle for putting cultural burns back on country. The second one involves engagement. This is probably another lesson for agency staff that are out there listening. Genuine trust must be actively established between parties. This must go beyond the normal understanding of external relationships management and will require new methods of engagement to create enduring personal and professional relationships between parties. Agency employees will need to go beyond their official roles to build these relationships. That's one of our key learnings. Relationships need to be established based on equity and integrity, and Aboriginal parties need to be equal partners in this rather than stakeholders. Engagement must be culturally appropriate. Now, these things might sound self-explanatory, but that's been a key learning for us and how we go about that in the future. Another maybe obvious thing, but should be pointed out, particularly given the conversations that Tim mentioned earlier and the interest around cultural burning and what it is and what it isn't. A cultural burn can only be nominated and led by traditional owners of that country. Cultural burning is the practical application of fire to the landscape by Aboriginal peoples. It is generally characterised by and mosaic in nature. Cooler burning sometimes done at night. These burns usually have multiple interconnected objectives, including protection of cultural or natural assets, ceremony, regeneration and management of food, fibre and medicines, fauna habitat protection, fuel reduction and healing country spirit, noting that fuel reduction is often not the primary objective. And I make that point because I think a lot of people are looking towards this, as Tim intimated, as purely a fuel reduction opportunity to protect townships in the future. Acknowledgement of cultural practices, custom and knowledge is and always will belong to traditional Aboriginal personnel and is not cool burning per se, is not a cultural burn. As I just mentioned, there's been lots of discussion about cool burning in the future. Our agency's making a big distinction between that and cultural burning at the behest of Aboriginal people. And lastly, self-determination should be the driver of this, acknowledging and respecting that traditional owners want to lead this process and importantly, at their pace with support from agencies and governments. This is an extremely important point. The at their pace thing often puts agencies want to do things quickly, get results quickly. We work for ministers and that's not disrespecting that, but we've been at pains to make sure that this is led at every level by local traditional owner groups. And as Tim said, Aboriginal people in the driver's seat is what we're very much trying to achieve. Commitment to empowering traditional owners as leaders in the management of their country must include provision of resources directly to traditional owner groups to create employment pathways and economic development opportunities for their communities. Now that's a very timely discussion at the moment with conversations that are happening around self-determination in Victoria in particular and elsewhere. One thing that the traditional owner groups also tell us is that they want to build a science-based research program that enables them to realise their aspirations in cultural fire management and the custodianship of their country. Since 2017, when the first 2 burns were done on Dja Dja country, there have since been about 20 traditional owner-led cultural burns. There's a couple happening across the state in the next few days. Now, this might sound quite modest, but there's a lot of work behind the scenes happening at the moment to re-regulate, to make it much easier for traditional owner groups, and we're working with the Federation of Victorian Traditional Owner Corporations and other groups to understand what they want and how we can support that. I mentioned that Mick Burke was appointed as the first Aboriginal burn planner a couple of years ago. Very recently, Trent Nelson was appointed as the first Cultural Heritage and Cultural Burning Coordinator, a role that has a statewide aspect. There is a new Cultural Burning Policy Officer position about to be advertised very shortly that will have a statewide role. And what's really encouraging, we've gone from these modest steps and building these strong partnerships. We have a joint fuel management planning process where burns are nominated. At the moment, we're in conversations, and very shortly there'll be anywhere between 80 and 100 traditional burns nominated on the joint fuel management program for the next 3 to 4 years. So there's been a massive growth in this very, very quickly. And that's it from me. Thanks, Tim.
Thanks, Scott. Let's put up that photo you had, you and Trent. I believe that was on your fellowship. Our final speaker before we go to the discussion is Minda Murray. Minda.
Thanks very much, Tim. That's a lovely photo. I love that of Trent and Scott there.
Mm-hmm.
So my name is Minda Murray. I'm currently on Yorta country, which is my traditional lands. So I just want to acknowledge the elders past and present. I'm extremely lucky. I'm sitting on the bank in a house on the banks of the Murray River, so I'm feeling very connected to the ancestors right now. So I'm very blessed. So I wanted to talk to you guys about self-determination in Victoria, which has been mentioned by a few of the other panel members so far. And also speak to cultural fire between policy and practice. Next slide, please, Tim. So there's significant policy that's being written to enable cultural burning in Victoria, but I wanted to talk about overcoming some challenges of that. And I will say now, I am coming from a Victorian perspective. That's what I know where I've come from. And also, I've come from an agency, a DELP background. I've just recently shifted over to ANU to continue my work and learning there. So I will be talking about some challenges that exist amongst fire agencies in Victoria. And I want to talk about the bigger picture of cultural fire as a piece of the puzzle for self-determination for our mobs in Southeast Australia. Next slide, please. So there's been, sorry, this is a different, you can flick forward to the rest of that slide. Thank you. So for all the great work that First Nations are doing and the willingness of fire agencies to embed cultural fire partnerships in land management, there also exist significant barriers. Sorry, we're on the barrier slide now, Tim. So agency policy is necessarily risk adverse. Unfortunately, much of the historical policy comes from a different time in Victoria where some of those policies had the intent to specifically exclude First Nations people from participating in society in Victoria. Thank goodness we moved on from those times, but the hangover is that some of those policies unknowingly still exclude or have barriers to First Nations being able to participate, let alone partner with land managers, and especially in cultural burning. So there still exists a power imbalance. Fire agencies are, of course, used to being in positions of authority. They're resource holders and distributors, data holders. Data is knowledge, and as we know, knowledge is power. So transfer of that power is important in achieving equality and partnership. There there's some amazing work being done by agencies such as DELP in having First Nations voices, and particularly moving into the leadership roles within the department, which is fantastic, and that is very necessary. But it's also a challenge in that retaining First Nations skill sets within First Nations organisations is also important. As First Nations, especially in Victoria, are moving towards this self-determination and asserting sovereignty, it's important to retain those skill sets within organisations. So this is not only a challenge, it's also an opportunity, because you know, there's partnership practices such as secondment of staff between First Nations organisations and fire authorities. So fire agencies are evolving to a partnerships approach with First Nations in Victoria, and taking some significant steps forward, but it doesn't happen overnight. So there's incremental steps in the policy reform space, and some exceptional leadership from agencies, which is hugely useful. But one of the biggest challenges is turning the policy rhetoric into actual practice on the ground. Fire agencies are large and complex, so again, it doesn't change overnight. So, you know, it may sound like a really simple thing, but these agencies are huge, and although there's some amazing policy that's been written, how do we actually make that happen on the ground? One example is, say we want more cultural burning out on public land, and there's a whole bunch of OH&S requirements for that, which is of course necessary to keep people safe, but are First Nations people who don't work for the agencies required to go through the same rigorous fitness testing and training that a project firefighter, say, would have, an employee would have? So, you know, it sounds really simple, but yeah, there's still this this void that everyone's working towards to close the gap between rhetoric and policy on the ground. This is also an opportunity for private landholders and other fire agencies such as CFA that do work on private land. They can also take a lead role here because they're not bound by some policies such as that. But thankfully, work is being done to address those learnings and those challenges. Next slide, please, Tim. So cultural burning, so cultural fire is a practice of culture, it's healing, it's law. It's also one element that's contributing to a bigger picture of self-determination reform in Victoria. Self-determination, for those who don't know, it's the right for Indigenous peoples to have a say in matters which affect them. And Victoria is currently leading the country in enabling self-determination in terms of its policy reform. And that reform means removing the barriers to and enabling self-determination. So there's also other legislation such as treaty, which is happening, which is very exciting. And this reform shifts the way First Nations and government work together from merely an inclusion approach to an actual partnership. So there's an evolution of partnerships there. Next slide, please. So this reform stems from the United Nations Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, of which Australia became signatory to in 2009. The Department of Premier and Cabinet published a guiding document for this reform called the VAF, Victorian Aboriginal Affairs Framework, after listening to First Nations voices across the state about what should be done to move to partnership. Under the VAF, the government was given a roadmap to guide its policy reform. So that's the Self-Determination Reform Framework. And this sets about how government can bring down structural barriers and enable self-determination, of which cultural burning is one of those elements. So it's a two-pronged approach. I guess the point I'm trying to make here is that it's this broader structural reform that Victoria is undergoing at the moment, which will enable cultural burning to happen more, and also cultural burning on the ground is providing some learnings and great opportunities for partnerships in moving forward to partnerships and Aboriginal people being able to practice culture on country. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Minda. And for those interested, there are some links there, and you can rewind the video if you need to look at the links. We're posting some on the YouTube chat. So now we have time for some discussion. And while people are on the YouTube chat thinking of their questions, and maybe even on Twitter, looking at the SSN Twitter, which is at SSN Deakin, or looking at the SSN seminar hashtag. I'm going to take my right as chair to pose some questions to our speakers straight away. So the first one, and all the different speakers, you all spoke to this understanding of cultural fire as something more than simply burning the landscape. And this is something I've come to understand through conversation with a lot of traditional owners around this topic. Cultural fire is about changing who makes decisions about fire and about country and how they make those decisions, which I think all the presenters spoke to, especially Bhiamie. So what do we each think? When you're explaining cultural fire to people, what are the kind of one or two top line things that you really highlight? And maybe what's the major misconception that you encounter? And hopefully across the four speakers, we'll get somebody will knock off the easy one, and then we'll get to some of the hard ones. So our first speaker was Bhiamie. So I'm just going to stop sharing the screen and let Bhiamie be the one who has to answer first.
Yeah, thanks, Tim. I think some of the common misconceptions, or definitely a common misconception that is quite prevalent, is that that I guess cultural burning is the same in different places, and that it's kind of this recipe or this suite of techniques, or tied to sort of doing in certain seasons. But like it really, what you said, Tim, about cultural fire being fundamentally changing who makes decisions, how those decisions are made, and I guess the reasoning for those decisions. That's like that. That's what it is. It's not the practice is great, and the practice is really what happens when fire gets into the landscape, and the positive benefits that flow on for the environment and for the people. But it's not. It's much more than a suite of techniques. It's much more than when you put it into the land. It's much more than the services that you're trying to get from it. It's the whole gamut of it. Fundamentally, cultural burning is about Aboriginal people and place. It's about country, and it's contrary to common misconceptions. It's not actually fire management. Fire is simply a management tool to manage the land, including water. So in that way of understanding it as a tool, we need to kind of, perhaps stay on that train of thought. You can't support cultural burning and not support the political rights of Aboriginal people to return to country and to have ownership, possession and managing authority of that country. So I'll leave it there and invite comment from other speakers.
We're all going to go at once, aren't we? Scott here. Look, I totally agree with what Bhiamie said, and I often hear people talk about it from a non-Aboriginal perspective as a technical and ancient, something in the way past, technical fire practice that can be used somehow in a contemporary fashion to reduce fuels. And how I articulate that as a fire manager is that fire is the tool to manage country holistically. I'll leave it at that.
Matt, I'm going to throw to you, and then Minda.
Yeah.
Thanks. Yeah, look, very well said, both of you, and Scott, Tim, you've framed it well. The number one question, or sort of line of questioning that I get from non-Indigenous folk is, referring to cultural burning as a technique, and as, you know, cool burning, and likening it to cool burning or mosaic burning and those sorts of things, which in some respects is correct, but only when you're taking a very, very narrow focus, as we've heard. You know, we're absolutely right in saying that cultural fire, yes, it is one tool for the management of country, and this whole process is about traditional owners working to activate their rights, and that is to undertake their cultural obligations for caring for country, to ensure that country is able to provide for all of us to live here. It is one tool in a suite of tools, and in a kind of a societal governance structure that enables, you know, traditional owners to take different roles in the management of country to ensure that it is healthy.
Yeah, I'm going to echo what everyone else on the panel has said. Seems to be a common misconception out there, and that, yeah, I just want to reiterate that cultural burning is not cultural burning without Aboriginal people. And it's not just going out and reducing fuel loads in a cool burn that's low risk. It's I want to describe that when you're there and you're on ground and you're using fire, and it's leading you through the landscape, you're also connecting to your stories and the ancestors. It's incredibly healing. So it's not just a practice that, you know, it's done just to have a sort of a flow on, oh yeah, this reduces fuel loads. It's holistic, and it means a lot to be there and to practice culture, with fire being, you know, the purpose for that. Also, I even had someone approach me once and ask, you know, and I admire the enthusiasm, but about creating a course where people could come and non-Aboriginal people could come and like learn how to do traditional burning, and then it would be like this, you get a certificate at the end, that type of approach. And, you know, I just had to explain it's not just a technique that, you know, anybody can do. It's traditional, is that Aboriginal people are involved and leading it and practicing culture in that holistic manner. So, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, leading on from this, I guess my next question, and then I promise we'll get to some that are coming through, is we're at a moment, as we've been covering, of kind of clear enthusiasm and interest amongst non-Indigenous people in cultural fire. But we're also at a moment of significant urgency, that with accelerating climate change, increasing bushfire impacts, increasingly stressed country, there's a real need to do something now, soon. So I was wondering about each of your perspectives on what are the things that we can do soon that would make a major difference potentially in scaling up cultural fire. And Bhiamie, did you just put up your hand?
I'll go first. You can start by giving land back to Aboriginal people. You know, like really, if you're going to get fair income about it, that's you know, that's a huge part of it. Unfortunately, the reality for many Aboriginal groups, especially in fire-prone southeastern Australia, is that they don't have a huge land base. So how can groups manage land if they aren't authorised to own it, possess it, manage it the way that they want to? So, you know, if you want to do something, you can talk to the local council about returning land to Aboriginal people. Like that's something really practical. And I think that, and there's a larger discussion that sits behind that of actually getting really down to place-based learning and place-based practices, you know, and supporting what everyone said about cultural burning being, you know, being allowed to be different. Of course it's going to be different. It's going to be different because Australia is such a vast continent with such different landscapes, you know. How you burn on the coast is going to be different to how you burn inland. It's going to be different if you burn in alpine areas. And yes, it's going to be different when you burn into areas that have been changed, you know, through human activity. So not only should it be allowed to grow and evolve naturally, and organically, it should be supported to do that, and having them localised conversations with Aboriginal people in that area is the starting point.
Matt, you had your hand up?
I did. Your first point, Bhiamie, is a great point, giving land back to Aboriginal people. And one of the responses to that I get quite often is, but there's, there is a significant portion of land in Victoria that is under Aboriginal title. As you so clearly discussed earlier, some of the barriers that around that and around that comes under the Traditional Owner Settlement Act and Native Title Act in Victoria, and that Aboriginal title is over public lands and national parks and those sort of things, which fall under huge volumes of restrictions for any people to be and operate in the ways they wish to, especially traditional owners. Traditional owner techniques for managing country aren't recognised as appropriate, and there's a ways to go for traditional owners to work with agencies to appropriately and respectfully embed that within the contemporary management sort of system, and that is through supporting and enabling traditional owners to take the authority over the management of country, resourcing traditional owners to do the work, to do the planning, to employ staff and rangers, to develop plans, to read country, to be out on country, as Bhiamie said, that place-based learning, observation of country, the changing seasons, all of these things to inform a really rigorous decision-making process for the right time to implement the right fire in the right way.
Scott or Minda, did either of you want to weigh on this question?
Yeah, thank you. I completely agree with those great points. For me, it's transfer of power is, it's just essential. We do have significant barriers in Victoria for land, for having authority over land. It's like you're only allowed to be self-determining up to a certain point until we're happy with you being self-determining, because that's the comfort level of agencies and past history. So allowing Aboriginal people to have more power and authority over the lands in which their traditional lands is super important. So I think for land managers, that's private agency, public landholders, I think just removing, I think just allowing that power transfer and being okay with giving that some of that power away in a more equal approach, I think is really important.
Scott?
Yeah, look, I probably had most of it's been covered, but I will just demonstrate something that I think we get the feedback as well as access to country and the transfer of authority and power, and I agree, and that's what we're enabling at the moment. And I use the word enabling deliberately. Resources for traditional owner groups directly rather than through agencies is what the conversations we're having with some local groups at the moment. They want to see those resources within their organisation, but they also want to see some of the resources within ours. So as a template, Mick Burke originally started working for the Zsa Zsa Run Corporation, but then wanted to work for us because he thought it would be better for their group to learn from us. So, but my point as an agency staff member is you've got to respect that. So we changed that. The photo that I didn't talk to earlier in my slide presentation, where Trent and I were in Missoula, Montana, we went out to the Flathead Indian Reservation, and the Salish Kootenai tribes took us around an area where they were treating and managing their land. So they'd done the thinning process. They're strikingly similar to Australia, different species, but the same colonisation process, power dynamics. But the vastly different thing that we saw there was it was their land, and they went to their elders and said, well, how do you want to manage it? So that was easy. And they had really, really good resources. Their NRM department was as good as I've seen anywhere in the world, funded by casinos. And when, but they had those two things: access and power and authority of their country to manage how they wished, and money. So they're the two. Thanks.
Thanks, Scott. Yeah, I think this is really just fantastic, and takes me to something that Aboriginal academics and activists have been saying for a long time. Thinking of somebody like Gary Foley, you have to, non-Indigenous people have so much of the power and so much of the resources. They have to give something up to progress things in this space. We've got a question from Vanessa Kavanagh. Kia ora, Vanessa. So good to have you on the line. Vanessa has a question specifically for Minda, which is, how can we encourage more Koori women in cultural fire and caring for country more generally?
Thanks, Vanessa. I think, so the first important point is it depends on where you are and which nation and which traditional land you're on as to women's traditional role in fire. We're not a homogenous group across Victoria. There's many different nations with different governance systems. So women's role in fire really depends on which place. Bhiamie was talking before about place-based approach. So, but where it is traditionally acceptable for women to be out there on the fire, I think that's absolutely amazing. Like I know of so many incredible, strong women, Aboriginal women who are working for DALP and who are leading cultural burns on the ground from their own mobs. I think more women sharing their stories about that would be really great, with support from some of our non-Indigenous agency staff and those sorts of things about, sharing that story about you can go out there and you can do this, and it's celebrated and it's special. So I think that would be really great to share some of those stories.
Right. Thank you, Minda. We have a question from, of all places, the Royal Society of Victoria, for all the speakers, and it's one that's about bush foods, which is something I guess we've seen recently highlighted, particularly in relationship to the work of somebody like Uncle Bruce Pascoe around foods and foods in their relationship with fire and country. So the question is, do the speakers think broader production of bush foods that respond to burning regimes, could this help be a resource for cultural burning programs across Victoria? And I'm going to throw to Matt, because I know he knows a bit about this topic.
I don't know if it's right to say I know a bit about this topic, but I have been working with some of my colleagues to support traditional owners in this space and to explore the role that traditional owners would like to have in relation to native foods and botanicals. So I think it's important to note that it's more than just bush foods, and Indigenous cultural understanding of the species and uses of species on country, being broader than just foods and food and botanicals. We hear a lot about bush food, bush medicine, bush tucker, those sorts of things, but there's also, as deeply understood by any mob on their country, the interrelationship between different plant species and the seasons, and it's their response to fire, as a food source for humans, as a food source for animals, and those sorts of things. We need to be careful when we're looking at the production of bush foods, as an example, and who is leading that and enabled to do that. Similarly to what Minda was talking about in terms of non-Indigenous people, coming from a positive place, wishing to learn more about cultural burning as a practice. we need to be supporting traditional owners to lead native food and botanicals industries. I think recovery of country would see more of those species on country and thriving in country. They are an indicator of healthy country. So if we're looking as to those sorts of species as an indicator of healthy country and a positive response to fire that's been put deliberately into landscape, then you know, as an outcome or a measurable outcome and those sorts of things, that it can help to resource cultural burning programs. And it is in some places in Victoria an aspiration of traditional owners to see those species flourishing on country once again, as our ancestors did see.
Unless anybody else wanted to answer that question, I think we might move to another question that's come through on the YouTube chat from Jacqueline Murphy. This question is, even on Aboriginal owned land, it can be hard for cultural burning to take place where custodians don't have the knowledge, resources and means to manage the land. Not quite, yeah, we'll leave it to the speakers to interpret that. What is the best way to approach this situation? Bhiamie, thought you might go first.
Yeah, thanks, Tim, and thanks for the question, Jacqueline. This is a question that comes up, I think, quite regularly when we're talking about the resurgence of cultural burning, and not just cultural burning, but Indigenous, I guess, land management and Indigenous connections to country throughout much of Southern Australia, in particular, where colonisation has hit hardest. I think there's a lot in that question, and I want to separate it to make it easier to respond to. And the first one, the first part of it is the resourcing for the country. Fire is a common resource, and we've seen the damage that fire can do. Because it's a common resource, it needs to be supported by government and by local government jurisdictions and by, you know, all the different agencies that are responsible to manage the land responsibly for the common good of everyone and for the common safety of everyone. So the question of resourcing is quite different to the question of, I guess, knowledge. And resourcing should happen, and we're seeing all too often what happens when agencies already doing land management and fire management aren't resourced properly, and the consequences of that. So we need to advocate for more resources, more training opportunities, and the like. The other part of that question is this question of groups who might not have, what people see as knowledge or sufficient knowledge. There's a lot to unpack in that question. I think we need to be careful not to get drawn into the colonial trap of trying to measure people's knowledge by what is absent, by what's been lost. I use lost in that way as if it's, sometimes it gets spoken about in the same way that one might lose their wallet, or someone might lose their car keys. Aboriginal people didn't just lose knowledge, right? It didn't fall out of our back pocket. Aboriginal knowledge was purposefully and in a targeted way. Knowledge was separated from people, and that was to serve a particular purpose. Okay, so there's a lot to be said for this perceived loss of knowledge when it wasn't lost at all; it was purposefully taken away. And focusing on what is absent, it detracts from looking at what's still there. And if we go to any Aboriginal community or any Indigenous community anywhere throughout the world, I think people will be genuinely astonished at the level of depth of knowledge, the level of connection that remains, and in many cases, the level of connection that has been enhanced through the experiences of colonisation. So we need to really, no one is speaking in the cultural burning world. No one is talking about this mystical kind of going back and managing land according to how ancestors did. It's about bringing those values and bringing those purposes of why people manage land, and applying it in a common, in the context of today, in a modern context. So, and that will require a blending of the old knowledges and the new knowledges. So what you're talking about is a creation fundamentally of something that, quite frankly, does not yet exist. we're creating new knowledge, and it's such an opportunity. But I strongly urge you not to look at what's lost and the perceived lack of knowledge, but rather look at the strengths of communities, the fact that they are still discrete communities, distinct communities attached to their land, and build on the strength and knowledge that remains. And there would be so much that remains.
Thanks so much, Bhiamie. Incredible answer. I've got a couple more questions before we wrap up. And one, I guess, is for the group, but I think I might throw to Scott first. And it's a question from Chris Kernowin. And Chris asks, just like terms like prescribed burn, controlled burn, and I might editorialize here, hazard reduction burn, these terms have created misunderstanding and division around how they're defined, what they're for. How do we avoid the same happening to cultural fire as a term? How do we avoid misunderstanding and division around this term?
Thanks, Chris. That's a really good question. Just to confuse things more, we generally call it plan burning here. So that's another phrase. Look, I think I call it an inform and educate piece. We've been working really closely with our TO partners for 5 years to understand that ourselves. And it's one of the reasons why I outlined earlier what the cultural burn is. Now, I didn't determine that. That's come from the Victorian cultural fire strategy. But I think there's a huge amount of work to be done to do that. I think there is a real risk that there's a misperception of that it's just another form of fuel reduction. But I would have to say that we worked really closely with our broader community, not only in the Loddon Valley, but across Victoria. And I think there's an incredible receptivity by the general public about supporting this. And in fact, we monitor our social media and other things pretty closely, being government, as you can imagine. And it's just really positive. I think there's been one or two slightly negative responses to this, but I think we all have a role to educate people about what it is and what it isn't. Thank you.
Did any other speakers want to speak to that issue? Matt or Minda, or should we go to the next question? If you don't raise your hand, no, Matt's unmuted.
Just very quickly, I think it's a term that should be defined by traditional owners. And I think what we're seeing at the moment, following the fires in summer, there is an increased interest in cultural burning as a technique, but also broadly that there is an increasing interest in sort of Aboriginal techniques for managing country and Aboriginal knowledges more broadly. We've seen that over the last couple of years as well through, popularisation of Bruce Pascoe's book in particular, that's talked about a lot in the media. So if we listen to Aboriginal people, listen to traditional owners to define it and follow their lead as leads of that knowledge and custodians of that knowledge and of country, I think that's a good pathway to not let it become divisive.
We've next got a question from Ben Cook, which I'm assuming is my colleague Ben Cook at RMIT. Ben says, thanks. I'm interested in whether cultural burning inherently challenges Western or colonial property rights, especially if and when burns cross property boundaries, or challenge property itself as a lens for seeing land and country. Matt, you've volunteered to field this one first.
Yeah, and I'm sure Bhiamie would like to have something to say about this too. In short, yes, it does. One of the key messages that came out very early in the development of the cultural fire strategy by traditional owners was that the multiple and complex arrangement of land tenure and the cans and can'ts on that is ridiculous to navigate when you're trying to undertake your cultural obligations to care for country. the purpose, one of the purposes of the strategy was to ensure that traditional owners were able to navigate the system and work with the right people, agencies, private landholders, different groups of people to activate cultural fire and put cultural fire back in the country regardless of tenure. A further piece of work that sort of, and a broader piece of work that that's happening at the moment in partnership with Victorian traditional owners that sort of contextualises cultural fire and a number of other traditional owner-led techniques for managing country is a program underway called looking at the rediscovering and cultural, what we're calling a cultural landscape, that is kind of listening to the stories and reading country and understanding, you know, what country is telling us needs to be put in place, sort of to an extent ignoring tenure. And there is a sort of policy reform piece happening at the moment in partnership with the department and with Parks Victoria about how we look at tenure in a sense, and how we look at planning and management of public lands largely, and with a view of sort of from a traditional owner perspective, influencing the private land sector as well, so that we look at the right indicators for caring for country rather than property and tenure. We're actually looking at what country is telling us and ignoring the fences largely, and putting in the right practices at the right time to ensure country's healthy.
You go, Bhiamie.
Yeah, Tim, I'll just add on to Matt, and thanks, Matt. And I think that's a really, a really comprehensive answer. But just to make the point as well, so the question was, whether cultural burning inherently challenges Western or colonial property rights. I think it needs to. Western colonial property rights, has contributed in a very large way to these incredible fire events that we're seeing. You know, the way land is managed is cut up, and different management techniques applied in different areas, and there's not a kind of uniform approach to managing the land. There's not a common ethic of managing the land. There's, those are the essential elements that really make landscapes safe and make landscapes, enjoyable in the long term and sustainable to live in. So it's not a question of if it does. Yes, it does, and it needs to. And I think all of us should be having that conversation. I think that's a really healthy conversation to have. And the other thing that I would say, again, as I said in the presentation, I think it's really time to revisit concepts like national parks. So, it's one thing to support the return of national parks or joint management of national parks or cultural burning happening in national parks, but the larger conversation is, what are national parks? What is the construct that where does it come from? If you look in the history of people, like, it's quite a new idea. So it's a new idea. It's fresh, and in Australia, I think we've got the knowledge and the skills, and we need to have the bravery now to question that concept. Like, what happens? What would it look like if the national parks, all national parks in this country, suddenly were not national parks but were cultural landscapes, and were viewed as cultural landscapes? How does that change people's interaction with those places? And as we know, national parks are a huge liability, when it comes to these incredible fire events in the late summer. So. I think we shouldn't be afraid to have the conversation about property rights. It's an essential part of it, and we need to, Indigenous knowledges and perspectives have so much to teach us about that.
Brilliant. We are tragically out of time, and I'm very sorry to everybody on the YouTube chat who we didn't have time to get to your question. In case I'm going to give the speakers one last moment in case anybody had a closing comment before I move on. No. So I thank you so much to our speakers, Bhiamie Williamson, Scott Falconer, Matt Shanks, and Minda Murray, for sharing your time and thoughts with us today. I really appreciate it, for the seminar about present and future directions for cultural fire. Thank you everybody for joining us live, and those who watch this afterwards. The seminar was supported by the Deakin Science and Society Network and the Bushfire and Natural Hazards Cooperative Research Centre. We hope the discussion has left you with a bit more informed and curious, hopefully, about cultural fire. And as you've seen, we've posted various links for resources and readings in the chat for those who want to follow up. And we have a plan to do a follow-up event on cultural fire and new policy developments later in the year. So please look out for that. Other than that, thank you, everybody. It's been a pleasure.
Thanks, Tim. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, everybody.